Hello and welcome to the Top 1000 World Banks ranking for 2023 from The Banker magazine. My name is John Everington. I am the Middle East and Africa editor for The Banker, and we're going to be discussing the results regarding the Middle East. But first of all, I'm joined by Joy McKnight, our editor, who's going to tell us about some of the big trends that we've been seeing internationally. Joy, so what are the top stories?
Well, this year we've seen a bit of a contraction across the three main metrics that we use. The top 1,000 obviously is its main metric is ranked, the banks are ranked by Tier 1 capital, but we also track things such as total assets and pre-tax profits. And what we've seen is a small contraction across those three metrics. So Tier 1 capital, for example, dropped by about 2% across the top 1,000. Total assets dropped by about 1.5%. And pre-tax profits dropped about 6.5%, which is a big turnaround from last year, where it saw a 50% rise in pre-tax profits across the whole top 1,000. But it's interesting because when you take a look at it, you think, oh, that's sort of bad news. Things have contracted. But at the same time, there's a main reason for that, which is the strength of the US dollar. After the Fed started rising interest rates, etc., the dollar strengthened against all the major currencies, including it strengthened about 12% against the British pound, about 9% against the Chinese yuan, and then about 7% against the euro. So that actually sort of clouded the results of the top 1,000 in 2023. But to be honest, when we look at things like assets, loans, and deposits, these are all very stable. I think the banks are, super well capitalized, and they're really preparing for what's coming down the line. Mm-hmm. At the top of the ranking, we have the Chinese banks, and this Chinese banks have, there's about 140 in the ranking in the totality. At the top is ICBC. And again, the Chinese banking sector sort of looks like it had a small contraction, but at the same time, if you take into consideration the dollar effect, and if you'd based the ranking in yuan, the Chinese banking industry would have grown by about 8%. However, that is a lot lower than the double-digit growth we've seen in previous years. And so you can see there is a general slowdown, but again, the banking sector is very stable. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about the Middle East. So what were the main findings in the region?
It's interesting talking about the fall of local currencies versus the dollar and the weakening in so many regions. The Middle East is the one big exception to that, I would argue, for this year, because you have the Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and so on, all have their currencies pegged to the US dollar. So the strength of the dollar didn't really affect these banks as much as it did in other parts of the world. And added to that, it was a windfall year for oil revenues for these states throughout the year because of the invasion of Ukraine. You had a spike in oil prices. That has started to subside somewhat, but I mean, you had a sort of a massive windfall revenue which came in during the year. So the Middle East has done actually very well. And in fact, of the top 25 banks of the region in this year's rankings, 22 of them increased their position this year.
Excellent. So who were the best performers in the Middle East?
So once again, Saudi National Bank, which was created a couple of years back from the merger of National Commercial Bank and Samba Financial Group, that remains kind of at the top of the tree in terms of the region, in terms of Tier 1 capital. They didn't have a sort of a massive Tier 1 capital growth this year. Deposits fell back. There are some post-merger integrations which are still going on there, but they still remain top of the pile in terms of Tier 1 capital, whereas Qatar National Bank is still the largest bank for assets. In terms of the sort of the big growers for the year, you had Kuwait Financial House, KFH, which completed a very long-running, a long gestating merger with Ahli United Bank towards the end of the year. And so that saw its kind of Tier 1 capital increase by around about 50%, which is slightly more, I think. So they were kind of one of the big risers. I think one of the star performers that we have to mention is a fellow Saudi bank, Al Rajhi Bank. So Al Rajhi had an astonishing 44% rise in Tier 1 capital, which I think was one of the best Tier 1 capital increases around the world in a non-acquisition situation. We've talked a lot in the past about the mortgage market in Saudi Arabia booming and sustaining kind of loan books. It's starting to cool a little bit, but it still grew around about 30% for the year. And also corporate lending was very, very strong indeed, linked to Vision 2030 projects in the Kingdom, a massive development project there. So Al Rajhi was the main beneficiary of that during the year.
Excellent. And the UAE is the second largest banking market in the region. You know, what's been happening there?
That's right. So yes, we had a little bit of a sort of a turnaround in terms of the sort of top positions there. Emirates NBD, which is Dubai's biggest bank, is now the biggest bank in the UAE by Tier 1 capital, after having a decent sort of increase for the year. First Abu Dhabi Bank, down the road in Abu Dhabi, where I used to live, they had a sort of flat year in terms of Tier 1 capital. They're now the second largest bank in terms of Tier 1 capital, even though they're still the biggest bank in terms of assets.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your insights,
You
John.
join.
And you can read all about the Middle East and the best performers in Saudi Arabia on thebanker.com/top1000.